Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast series by Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm Giuseppe Porcaro.
I'm Alicia Garcia Herrero.
And today we will discuss about the direction China seems to be taking, accentuated during the last few months, towards a much more interventionist socialist model centered around the idea of common prosperity. This episode is part of Bruegel's focus on global China as seen from Europe, which includes our monthly newsletter, ZhōngHuá Mundus, to which we invite you to subscribe. The link is in the show notes. Joining our conversation today from Los Angeles is Mingxin Pei, who is professor of government at Claremont McKenna College and a non-resident senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Hello, Mingxin. How are you?
Good. How are you, Giuseppe?
Very well, very well. Today we really are truly global with our podcast recording because you're sitting in Los Angeles, I'm sitting in Brussels, and Alicia is sitting in Taipei. So we've been struggling with time zones, but here we are, the three of us. So that's great. Let me get into the topic. The concept of common prosperity has deep roots in the Chinese Communist Party. It was already used in the 1950s under Mao Zedong as part of an effort to bolster the case for socialism over capitalism. And in the late 1970s, with Deng Xiaoping, the term was used again, but in a reverse fashion, saying that allowing some people and regions to get rich first would speed up economic growth and help achieve the ultimate goal of common prosperity, which, to a certain extent, echoed the trickle-down economy paradigm, which was very much in fashion in the high days of neoliberalism under Thatcher and Reagan on the other side of the planet. President Xi Jinping highlighted this concept during his comments to the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee for Financial and Economic Affairs on August 17 this year, calling for China to achieve common prosperity, seeking to narrow a yawning wealth gap that threatens the country's economic ascent and the legitimacy of Communist Party rule. In China, there are still some 600 million workers who live off a monthly income of less than $154. The fact that a poor population, nearly twice the size of the full population of the United States, lives alongside a wave of first-generation billionaires and millionaires who consume nearly half of all luxury goods sold globally creates complexities for social cohesion in China. Mingxin, you have highlighted already in 2016 in your book China's Crony Capitalism, a system based on entrenched privileges and criminality. Do you see Xi's plea for common prosperity as a response to the need to do something about it?
Surely, I think Xi Jinping and his colleagues are aware of the enormous problem of inequality in China. I support policies that will bring down inequality, that will improve social welfare for everybody. The question, of course, is how do you do it? So far, we don't know what kind of policies the Chinese government will pursue to reach that noble goal. Based on the rhetoric, it's not very reassuring. We don't see certain things that should be done to address China's inequality being referenced in government rhetoric. Of course, right now the rhetoric is quite vague, but if you take the rhetoric in its totality, it appears to be some kind of repetition of old-fashioned communist idea of enforced inequality rather than a much more, what should I say, economically rational, some kind of equality that will not come at the expense of economic efficiency and productivity.
Alicia, what is your take on what is going on, and perhaps also expanding a bit on what Mingxin just tell us?
Well, first of all, I thank you, Minchin, for your wise words. And thank you, Giuseppe, for that intro, because it was quite impressive, I have to say, bringing all of that together and how the West and China, in a way, have mirror policies in a way. When we were more, like liberal, China was in a different phase. Then, frankly speaking, in Europe, we do not use the word capitalism for our system. We use social democratic. We try to appease that doubt that we could be exacerbating inequalities, and thus we use, and this is the key I want to highlight here, we use the welfare state and we use progressive tax systems. That's what we do in Europe. Now, the question is, to me, for Minchin really is that what China has in mind? I tend to think that I don't see the signals in that direction, but I may not be informed enough to make that statement. So what do you think? Is China becoming Europe, Minchin, or does China have something totally different in mind?
I agree with you. We don't see any signals that would suggest that the Chinese government is seriously thinking about higher taxation or redistribution through the taxation system and through the welfare state arrangements. So right now, we just don't see anything. But the rhetoric itself appears to be quite worrying. It's the connotation sounds very similar to the kind of rhetoric of the Maoist era. And I tend to look at whether the government comes out with reassurances. So far, we've not seen any reassurances or clarifications because I'm sure the Chinese government actually pays attention to what the international media says, to what the Chinese public thinks about this slogan. I think at this stage, it's really no more than a slogan, common prosperity. And at the moment, there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of concern. And if the government wants to clarify its position, it should actually send some very authoritative people to explain to the media what the direction of its policy or its strategy of seeking common prosperity is. In fact, I think the issue of inequality in China is not a new one. It's being talked about in all kinds of circles for more than 2 to 3 decades. And the solutions are not actually that complicated. They all know what needs to be done. They need to deal with the biggest cleavage or division, disparity, is really between rural areas and urban areas. And we know what the solution is. You liberalize the hukou system, the household registration system, so that migrants can gain urban citizenship treatments. You invest a lot in rural education and health. So these are the things that should be done. And I think there should be a lot of public support for that.
I see, Mingxin, what you're saying, and indeed, even in the press, there has been a lot of worrying about the principle that was announced before I mentioned Xi discourse in August, especially when they speak about reasonably adjusting excess incomes. A lot of people have been worried that this would have been taking money from the rich. I've read that a senior economic official, Han Wenzhou, did a briefing in August 26, and he explained to trying to calm down these fears that common prosperity means doing a proper job of expanding the pie and dividing the pie, and clearly says we will not kill the rich to help the poor. So there is, at least what we are seeing at the moment, there is some sort of trying to calm down and smoothen up the rhetoric that we are seeing, but what exactly there is behind those announcements, as you say, is still not very clear. So I would like to ask you, what do you think there is behind all this?
If I may say so, I think Mr. Han is simply too junior. His position is a vice minister, and he's a dime a dozen. Lots of people like him. So his words are not going to be credible. We need somebody of the rank of at least a vice premier, somebody like, or a Politburo standing committee member, and better still, Xi Jinping himself. Because Mr. Han, obviously he got some kind of authorization to go public with that. But why not asking a much more serious, much more senior official to reassure the public?
Speaking about reassurance, let's focus for a moment on the crackdowns, because if there is one thing that we've been seeing with an impact on the global scale has been the series of crackdowns which we have been seeing in the past few months. We've been seeing that there are several of those crackdowns happening simultaneously on business sectors and individuals while we're speaking. Many, though not all, this should be very clear to the listeners as well. Not everything has been put into the same package, but some of those crackdowns fall under the umbrella of the concept of common prosperity. Can we explain to our listeners what is going on, why it's going on, and what is the economic impact?
Yeah, well, I think the crackdowns we're really talking about, the crackdown on data security, which affects mostly platform companies that have some kind of foreign connection, listed abroad or about to go abroad and get listed. So that's mostly tech startups or platform companies. The second kind of crackdown is crime schools. These are online education, nearly all of them listed in the US or in Hong Kong, that provide after-school coaching. And the third kind of crackdown is the crackdown on video games, like 3 hours per week. These are the three big crackdowns that affect a lot of tech companies, mostly, I think, tech companies, because the crime schools are some online crime schools. I don't see only one might be tangentially connected with common prosperity. And that's a crackdown on crime schools, because that deals with the issue of education inequality. But whether that crackdown is going to address education inequality is a very different matter. The tech crackdown, platform companies, in terms of the data security, is a national security or regime security issue. And the crackdown on video games is really a sort of a manifestation of China's nanny state. I'm sure there are justifiable reasons for dealing with this issue. The question is this the best way, the right way, the only way to deal with addiction? So that's, I think, what makes people really worry about these measures, these policies, is that the government rolled them out very abruptly without appearing to have consulted with the so-called stakeholders, businesses, and the people who will be affected, parents. And I do not believe that Chinese policymakers have thought through very seriously about the consequences. And the financial markets have reacted very poorly to this kind of conduct, this kind of rather arbitrary exercise of power. So we don't know whether the Chinese government will make some adjustments. So far, we've not seen any, but I hope that they will rethink their approach. These are real problems, but the way they are addressing these problems might be counterproductive rather than productive.
Alicia, do you want to add something to this?
Yes, I'd like to add, comments and perhaps a little bit of a question right after that. So first, I fully agree. This is, on the one hand, data sovereignty. We have different models in the world. Yeah, the US model, companies, the European model, people own the data, for better or worse. There's other problems with that as well. And I think in China's case, very obviously, the party owns the data. So I guess that's basically what has happened. I don't think it's only antitrust issues or the size of the companies, because this is well known and it could have been handled differently by obliging companies to divide their businesses. I mean, there's many other ways to do this. So I guess it's not so much the antitrust side of things. On the education front, one could argue this is equality of opportunities, but then on the other hand, there's a huge amount of issues to tackle in China in terms of the cost of education beyond the cram schools and the online education. In other words, if that were the issue, you could have put it together, and offer a solution, especially to tertiary education and even high school. Yeah, the cost of high school is there for many families. So I just feel that it would have been more credible if it had been put into a reform of education. And that's the second comment I have. Many people argue very strongly that the gaming issue is really to put the talent elsewhere because that sector is too profitable. But you can tax the sector. You don't need to limit the demand. You can just tax the profit. Thus, people will do something else, semiconductors, you name it. So in a way, that all of these issues are dealt exactly what Minchin said. In this way, it makes me think, because we need to also remind the audience that many of these companies are private. And we have a very good paper. I don't know whether it's already published. Giuseppe, maybe you can remind me, on the role of private companies in China with the Petersons. It's a joint effort. And it's very telling that all of the graphs they show seem to indicate that the private sector, because of the new economy, basically, have been growing massively in China, because their valuations in the stock market indeed had been growing. It's no longer the case because of the crackdown. But we all know that their power has not been growing. Their degree of influence has not been growing. So this is, in a way, a confirmation that, to me, my reading is that there was fear of that growth of the private sector, partially because of the stock market valuation, maybe not necessarily in terms of assets, but something had to be done because they were becoming very, very big in the sectors which determine the future. That's my sense of what might have been happening. But of course, I'm very eager to hear Minchin's comments on this regard.
Yeah, well, when you look at the victims or the people who have paid dearly in the wake of the crackdown, it will be very hard to find somebody who is connected with the state, a company connected with the state. Mostly, we're talking about foreign stockholders, equity holders, and private Chinese tycoons, because they lost their paper wealth. That kind of wealth cannot be redistributed within China, so it's not really about common prosperity. I think what bothers me, it's the implicit message conveyed through such crackdown, is that you may be wealthy, but ultimately we have the power. And that kind of attitude is not one private entrepreneurs would like to hear.
Thank you, Mingxin. Indeed, this poses a question about the political side of all this. We've been speaking a bit about the economic side, but there is definitely a political aspect about this whole system, and things can always be read on a double way. So that makes the direction to go quite uncertain, as you mentioned. My question, because you mentioned the video games, we mentioned the education system, so we went already a little bit further than the crackdowns themselves, but also for the clarity for how much do we know so far, what can we do, what can we say about the rest of the package of this common prosperity? What are the other measures that we know are being announced or they've been associated so far with this discourse of common prosperity, if there are some others that we didn't touch so far?
I'm not aware of any. Maybe I'm just too busy teaching my students at my college. Every day I read headlines of Chinese official news sites. I don't see any. I think timing-wise, if you look at how the Chinese government does things, probably the bureaucracy is starting to sort of draft policies. And it can take a while. So when you look at the calendar, I think November might be a good time to watch because the party central committee is going to meet and we want to see what kind of big resolution comes out of their plenum. And that typically would give you a signal about policy announcements next March when the National People's Congress meets. My guess is that we're not going to see a really comprehensive program until a year later when Xi Jinping gets a new term, and that will be his platform.
Alicia, do you want to add something on this kind of calendar?
Yeah, I fully agree, but it makes me think of a word I've used recently to describe the way in which common prosperity has introduced, which is rushing it through. And let me clarify. We frankly had a first attempt to mention common prosperity actually in November before that speech, but it wasn't really in the context of an important speech in the sidelines of the demise of Ant Financial's IPO. So somehow you could argue this has been at least, in somebody's, or at least somebody for sure, but maybe more than a person's head for a while, but we don't have any reference in the 5-year plan. So if you think about how come something as we had dual circulation very central to that 5-year plan, if this concept, common prosperity, is so important, why wasn't it coupled together? I could even imagine, if you were to give me this task, Giuseppe, couple these things together, I can assure you I can do it, because there are things you could argue that to create this dual, the domestic side of the dual circulation, you need a welfare state, because you need people to make sure they can consume, that their minds are freed from other problems. There's a way to link this, but there was no attempt, or perhaps this concept has been rushed in. That's what I mean. That then the question I would have is, why has it been rushed in? And I want to add, and I know it's a different topic, but just because I'm also rushing in, I know that we're short of time. There's one important thing that happened in August 2020, before even the Ant Financial demise, which is the very famous by now free red lines on the real estate sector, which supposedly now, if you see what everybody's writing, are related to the common prosperity, in as far even myself, but in a way, one wonders whether they are related, because it is a way to moderate housing prices, to improve, therefore, affordability. This is something that needed to be done in the light of a new objective, which is perhaps even more important than growth by now, which is common prosperity. So we're all rereading, what we saw back in August 2020. But to me, as a researcher, as a work, if I'm rereading this, and this was something that was thought to be a good thing to do, why didn't it take such a space in the 5-year plan? So I'm scratching my head between these two hypotheses: very well planned, this, dealing with this big problem, the real estate sector, or rushing it through and justifying actions that are being taken. So I want to ask this question to Minxin. How do you read this? Was it rushed? Was it planned?
Okay, well, in fact, I'm going to spend about 10 days in October, not right now, to do a thorough research of the common prosperity theme, because it is a very important theme. So if we were to have this conversation, say in a month, I will have a much better answer, because I will be going through a lot of documents, speeches, to see where it was first mentioned, what kind of propaganda campaign was launched to amplify this slogan. But right now, my hunch is this. I believe that it is a very deliberate plan to showcase that this will be Xi Jinping's policy platform, because you have to make a very convincing case that resonates with the people. if you want another term. That is, you want to convince them that you've accomplished a great deal, but the work remains undone. And this is a very important task for the party. And they need strong leadership to see it through. So if my hunch is right, you should see a consistent pattern in all the Communist Party propaganda machines that will highlight this thing. So I have not counted the number of references to this in speeches. Actually, it's really important to look at provincial party secretaries, whether they are emphasizing common prosperity. If they are, then we know that something very serious, concerted, organized is going on. So that's my initial hunch.
Building on your initial hunch and what Alicia just said, I mean, one of my question is very much linked to what Alicia said. It's like, it seems to me that this is not really a new strategy. You know, moving beyond the politics that you just mentioned, you know, moving beyond the personalization of the politics and the next moves within the party and going a little bit more broader than that. The dual circulation strategy involved growing the Chinese middle class in order to increase domestic consumption. So the plan would require transferring wealth from the government to private citizens at some point. But when the dual circulation strategy was announced, it seemed something new, but also it was not very new either. You know, scratching the rhetoric of the surface linked to the geopolitical confrontation and the pandemics, what stays there, it's not something super new. I think that there was already in 2006 a government work report described the importance for a strategy expanding domestic consumption and strengthening the role of consumption in fueling economic development. So, like, going more broader, also because we are going towards the end of the episode, I would like to hear your analysis of the longer term. How do we read this whole thing, both in the context of the past 20 years and the next 20 years? I know it's very ambitious to do to end our podcast, but it's also to bringing a little bit the discussion broader than just the nitty-gritty politics that might drive, of course, some of the things that we've been discussing so far.
Yeah, well, when you look at the last 20 years, you will see the government has said a lot of things, promised a lot of things. So you really have to see what things that they have said, promised to do, have actually been accomplished. The list is not very long. That is the list of things they promised to do and have accomplished. Let's just look at dealing with inequality. Really have not seen a whole lot. Dealing with domestic consumption, some minor improvement, but not a whole lot. Talking about fiscal reform, not a whole lot. I think for the last 20 years, the government was able basically to ride on the coattail of reasonably high growth, which allows them to make some marginal improvements without solving the structural issues. So that's the last 20 years. In the next 20 years, this approach is unlikely to work because they are faced with an entirely new environment. External environment, obviously, we all know, relations with the US have basically collapsed. Relations with other Western countries are very fragile. Now, I think with Europe is okay, but still we have a lot of problems. That's an ongoing story. Nobody can promise that it's not going to become worse, okay? And domestically, now with this Evergrande business, I think the bill is past due. They have to deal with deleveraging. Now it's being forced on them. So then you look at the deteriorating fundamentals, slowing productivity, slowing growth of labor force. On top of that, you have a set of government policies that do not appear to be very friendly to the market. So, in other words, you have a combination of very negative factors converging, much more so in the next decade than in this decade. So I think probably at the end of the 20-year period, you're going to see a lot of changes, but those changes will be forced on the government rather than changes the government would proactively embrace or make.
Alicia, I'm waiting for your reaction.
Well, it's just basically very much in line with what we've been writing for Bruegel on China. So Giuseppe knows it all. I mean, this is this idea that China is decelerating structurally for all of the reasons that Minxin explained. And I would add that the miracle, because that's the way I would describe it, of innovation wiping out all of these negative factors is literally impossible for an economy of the size of China. Maybe if you are Israel, if you're Singapore, but if you have the complexities and the size of an economy like China, with 600 million people in the rural area, it's just utterly impossible. In fact, we see it in the data because total factor productivity is basically stagnant. Labor productivity is coming down. So, you don't see the impact of innovation. And by the way, also because although R&D is indeed 2.4% latest figure of GDP, is mostly business development, 6% only basic research. So my point is, not only is this true, is that there's no way, there's nothing there, not even innovation that can stop it, because it's just too important. And all of the factors go in the same direction. So this brings me to my last point, which is that what if not only, I mean, I'm sure that we're not the only ones who know that China is decelerating structurally. Yeah, I'm sure that the party knows this in and out. And therefore, maybe all of these policies from dual circulation and we, this is the piece for China Leadership Monitor, basically on dual circulation. Knowing all of this, you basically need to do two things: to leverage on your market as much as you can, because you own it. You actually own it in this mindset, at least. And secondly, you do whatever it takes to ensure social stability by sharing what you have, both income and wealth, before you don't have it anymore. Because, it's like a photo. You take the photo today, you cut it in pieces, because if you take that photo tomorrow, it's already smaller. By cutting it in pieces, though, you may make it smaller yourself. But you need to run this risk because you know exactly where you're heading. And I think that regaining control through this crackdown and this idea of sharing the existing wealth is a way for you to keep your bullets, because you will need those bullets as the economy slows down. So for me, in a way, it does make sense. It's not crazy. It makes sense to impose this on the economy now before it is harder for you to do so, because you may have less credibility, less growth, everything together. So that's basically my thinking of why this is happening.
Thank you, Alicia. Mingxin, I don't know if you want to react from the last things that Alicia just said.
Yeah, I just want to add one observation that this is a country ruled by the party that together have not seen a serious, prolonged period of stagnant economic growth. So we don't know what is going to happen. Japan could survive 2 decades of practically zero real growth. China cannot survive 5 years of zero real growth, because all kinds of problems will emerge to the surface. And it's a very dynamic situation. So I think Alicia may have the right theory, but maybe many of the assumptions built into this policy in top Chinese circles need to be re-examined.
Of course, Mingxin, you're completely right to put the question, and this is an ongoing debate. And of course, we could continue this conversation for longer, but unfortunately, our time is up. But we keep our analysis of global China scene from Europe in our monthly newsletter, which I invite all our listeners to subscribe. The link is in the show notes. And also I invite everyone to read in open access all the analysis by our scholars, a lot of which is focusing on monitoring and analyzing what is going on in China, but as well in the rest of the world, and not only in Europe, on our website, which is www.bruegel.org. Mingxin, Alicia, thanks a lot for joining this conversation on two sides of the planet. And thanks to our listeners for following us. Until next time, bye-bye.
Thank you, Giuseppe. Thank you, Mingxin.
Okay. Bye.